In short, Scotland is the source of some of my happiest memories, but also my saddest. I was in Balmoral when I was told that my mother had died. Still in shock, I found sanctuary in the service at Crappie Kirk that very morning. There are moments when everything you thought you knew comes crashing down. For Prince William, that moment arrived quietly, wrapped in documents that would tear through his world like a blade. The cameras showed us a prince standing tall, greeting crowds, fulfilling duties with practiced grace. But what the lenses couldn't capture was the storm brewing behind those composed eyes. Something had reached him. Something so powerful it would send him running toward the only place where truth still existed. The Scottish Highlands waited in silence. What pushed the air to vanish without explanation? What knowledge forced him to abandon protocol and seek refuge in the mist? Everything started falling apart on an ordinary Wednesday evening. A private aircraft was cutting through darkening clouds above London. No announcements had been made. No royal schedules mentioned this flight. Palace workers, who should have known about every movement, were left confused. The jet carrying Prince William northward did so under complete secrecy, filed under names that meant nothing to anyone. This wasn't normal. This felt urgent, right? The hidden journey that changed everything. Think about what it takes to move a future king across the country. Security teams need briefing. Staff coordinate every detail. Press offices prepare statements. None of that happened here. The departure time kept changing, shifting back and forth, as if someone couldn't decide whether to go through with it. When the plane finally took off, it did so with silence that screams, "Something's wrong." People who tracked these things immediately knew this wasn't standard procedure. Within hours, online communities began buzzing with questions. Where was Prince William going? Why the secrecy? The answers wouldn't come easily. Some observers pointed toward Balmoral, that ancient castle where royals had retreated when the world became too much. Others sensed something deeper, something more personal. William had always turned to Scotland during dark hours. The land held memories of childhood summers, of walking beside his grandmother through green fields. But this time felt heavier. Earlier that day, cameras had caught him leaving Windsor Castle, looking visibly tense. He kept checking his phone over and over, like someone waiting for news they didn't want to receive. His usual route home got abandoned. The convoy changed direction suddenly. By the time darkness settled, Prince William had disappeared completely. No official word came from the palace, just silence, and in that silence 1,000 theories began to grow. Royal correspondents started connecting pieces that didn't fit. Some whispered about family tensions building for months. Others talked about new information surfacing, documents or messages revealing things nobody was prepared to handle. There were even quiet suggestions that private communications had been intercepted. When the aircraft finally descended through Scottish rain that night, the runway was empty except for a single vehicle waiting in shadows. No photographers, no crowds, just rain pouring down, creating a curtain of secrecy. A lone figure emerged from the plane and stepped into the mist, carrying something invisible but crushing. The question that haunted every observer was simple but impossible to answer. What truth had Prince William uncovered that drove him to flee everything familiar? When smiles hide breaking hearts in the weeks before that secret flight, something had been shifting. If you knew where to look, you could see it. The public saw perfect appearances, carefully constructed moments where everything seemed fine. But people who understood body language saw something else. They noticed how his laughter didn't sound quite right anymore, how his eyes would drift away during conversations like his mind was somewhere far from the room, how the ease that once defined his presence had been replaced by something more mechanical. At a mental health event in Manchester, I didn't know anything about mental health. I really didn't. And I immersed myself in this topic because we identified that this was a key social problem. William spoke about strength, about community, about facing challenges together. His voice remained steady throughout, but when he finished and stepped away, an assistant approached with a folded piece of paper. For just a second, his expression changed. Something in that note hit him hard. Minutes later, he was gone, rushed into a waiting vehicle without the usual friendly waves. People close to the royal circle started noticing patterns. Engagements suddenly got postponed. Official explanations talked about scheduling conflicts, but the pattern was obvious. William was pulling back, creating distance between himself and the public role he'd been trained to perform. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere changed. Staff members described an unusual quiet settling over the building. William spent long stretches alone in his private study, leaving written notes instead of having conversations. Meetings that used to include laughter became brief and formal. Family photos remained in his office, but visitors noticed him staring at them differently now, as if drawing strength from memories of better times. The British press began publishing speculation. Headlines wondered about stress, exhaustion, the impossible demands of public life. Palace spokespeople issued calm statements insisting everything was fine, but those carefully chosen words only deepened the mystery. Behind the official denials, something had clearly shaken William to his core. Friends who'd known him since childhood described changes in how he communicated. Where he used to speak eagerly about his work, his words now came more carefully measured. Sentences got shorter. Humor appeared less often. The evening before his sudden departure, someone spotted him driving alone through Windsor's grounds late at night. No security escort, no official vehicles, just one car moving slowly through the mist. Witnesses said he sat motionless behind the wheel, hands gripping tight, completely lost in thought. He didn't return home until well past midnight. The next morning, he appeared at an environmental event, looking as polished as ever. Every gesture seemed carefully controlled, like armor protecting him from whatever truth he was carrying inside. Those photographs would later become symbols of something haunting, a man performing his role beautifully while breaking apart underneath. The truth that changes everything. Truth doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, slipping through doors you thought were locked. For Prince William, the truth arrived in papers placed on his desk, in messages that shouldn't have existed, in reports compiled by people he trusted. The information contained in those documents didn't just surprise him. It shattered foundations he'd built his entire life upon. This was betrayal, loss, and revelation, all twisted together. Something shifted inside Kensington Palace after those documents arrived. The normal rhythm stopped. Staff members described the change as immediate and complete. Meetings got canceled without explanation. Phones went unanswered for hours. People noticed he'd locked himself away in his private study, spending entire days reviewing papers, his face growing darker with each page. When he finally emerged, he moved slowly, his skin pale, his eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Sources connected to the royal household later hinted that this information came from outside the usual channels. Nobody had been prepared for it. Behind all the ceremony and tradition, it became obvious that the prince was processing something too painful to discuss openly. People who met with him during those days said he seemed elsewhere, his focus distant, his responses automatic. He remained polite and composed, but disconnected. His gaze would drift toward windows, lingering on distant horizons as if searching for answers in the sky. The weight of what he'd learned began isolating him from everyone. Family dinners that used to include laughter became quiet affairs. His children played in the gardens, unaware their father was pacing corridors, wrestling with knowledge that threatened everything. Friends who tried reaching out found their calls ignored. The news he'd received hadn't just shaken his faith in people around him. It had reopened old wounds that had never properly healed. By the time he decided to go to Scotland, William's silence had become his only protection. Scotland wasn't just another destination. It represented memory, healing, connection to something ancient. His grandmother had found peace there. His mother had escaped palace chaos there. For him, it remained the one place untouched by scandal or lies. The flight got arranged outside official channels. Only a handful of people knew. When the jet finally lifted off, it carried not just Britain's heir, but a man crushed by revelation. As the plane pushed through Scottish mist, William's mind replayed everything leading to this moment. Every conversation he'd dismissed, every warning he'd ignored now echoed with new meaning. The truth had been waiting all along. Now it stood before him in complete clarity, impossible to look away from. This discovery devastated him, not just because of what it revealed, but because of what it destroyed. The fragile trust holding together his private world had crumbled. Scotland's air carries a peace that London can never match. When Prince William's car finally wound through narrow roads toward Balmoral Castle, midnight had come and gone. Headlights cut through thick mist, bouncing off iron gates that had protected royal privacy for generations. Balmoral had always served as refuge. Now it waited for another wounded heir seeking shelter. Inside the castle, only essential staff knew about his arrival. Security got tightened immediately. Cameras were disabled. Public access to surrounding grounds was quietly blocked off. The prince hadn't come for rest. He'd come seeking clarity. Morning brought sounds of footsteps on gravel and wind sweeping through trees. William spent hours walking paths his grandmother had loved. Highland solitude gave him space to think without constant duty pressing down. In a secluded wing, a meeting was arranged behind closed doors. Royal advisors arrived in unmarked vehicles. Behind locked doors, conversations stretched through afternoon into evening. Documents got reviewed repeatedly. Difficult truths were confronted directly. For William, each discussion deepened his understanding of what he'd discovered. The evidence couldn't be dismissed. It had potential to shake not just his personal world, but the entire institution he'd been born to lead. People present described him as serious but steady. He listened far more than he spoke, weighing every word with patience. During breaks, he'd walk to windows overlooking hills that rolled endlessly toward the horizon. Those close to him said it seemed like he was asking the landscape itself for guidance. Evening brought him to the small family chapel on the estate. Under dim candle light, he sat alone in wooden pews. Whatever burden he carried, he was laying it before something greater than himself. Outside, Scottish rain fell again, soft and endless. It washed over castle roofs, over gardens, over stone paths where William walked alone with his thoughts. Somewhere between the whispering wind and the weight of memory, he reached a decision. The time for thinking was ending. The truth he'd confronted at Balmoral demanded action now. Though his heart still carried heaviness, his resolve was forming. The prince who'd arrived broken in spirit was slowly finding strength to stand again. Echoes of a mother's wisdom. Prince suddenly found himself face-to-face with several of the world's top supermodels. As William said in the documentary Diana, Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, Balmoral's quiet held more than weather and wilderness. It held memory. Every stone surface, every narrow hallway seemed to whisper one name, Diana. For Prince William, This place wasn't just retreat. It was sanctuary connected to the deepest parts of his past. He walked trails she'd once loved, the same fields where she'd brought him and Harry as boys to escape royal life's constant glare. As he looked across misty hills, he could almost hear her voice, gentle, protective, urging him towards strength. William had spent his adult years balancing two worlds, one shaped by duty and tradition, the other modeled by his mother. A life grounded in compassion, empathy, and honest truth. The discovery shattering his peace was testing that balance. Now inside Balmoral's library, William spent long stretches reading through personal notes and letters. Among carefully kept documents sat a handwritten letter from his mother written in the late 90s. She'd written about hoping her sons would stand for honesty when the world chooses silence. Those lines struck him deeply. They reminded him that legacy isn't preserved through perfection, but through courage. His mother's experiences had shown what happens when truth gets buried for appearances. The discovery he'd made carried a similar warning. Something threatening to repeat the very mistakes that had haunted his family for decades. He realized staying silent would betray the principles she'd died defending. In the castle's drawing room, William began writing. He filled pages with thoughts, reflections, plans. The act of writing seemed to connect him to her spirit, reminding him that his journey was part of a larger story still unfolding. By nightfall, he returned to the small chapel again. He sat silent, hands folded, head bowed. Above him, a stained glass window glowed faintly, depicting a mother and child surrounded by angels. This was where he understood that grief, when faced with courage, could transform into guidance. His mother's life had been marked by heartbreak, but her legacy remained one of love and resilience. Now it was his turn to carry that legacy forward. Dawn broke over the highlands. William stood by a window, eyes fixed on the horizon. His mother's spirit seemed to move with the wind outside. Mother's death seems reasonable. That's who he'd think it is. When the ghost actually appears, turns out to be the ghost of Princess Diana, a silent reminder that truth, regardless of its pain, must always be faced. Prince William stopped running from what he'd learned. He was standing within it, letting lessons from the past prepare him for what lay ahead. The boy who'd walked beside her in these same fields was now a man walking into the storm she'd warned him would come. And he was ready to meet it when the storm finally breaks. When Prince William's plane touched down in London again, Scotland's peace vanished immediately. The moment his car passed through Kensington Palace gates, the silence surrounding his trip got replaced by questions. Questions from staff, from advisors, from a press corps already circling inside palace walls. Tension hung thick. William moved through hallways with quiet purpose, acknowledging greetings with nods, but offering zero explanations. The time for thinking was finished. Decisions would have to be made now. His first public engagement was a community event in London. Cameras clicked constantly. Reporters shouted over each other. Yet his manner stayed calm, measured, almost impossible to read. He smiled for photographs, but the warmth, usually defining his presence, seemed muted. Palace sources released a brief statement calling his trip a period of private reflection. It was short, deliberately vague, and did nothing to calm the storm. Media seized every word while royal experts debated deeper meanings. The truth remained locked behind closed doors. Back home, his children's laughter filled gardens again. Catherine kept their household calm, shielding the family from noise beyond the walls. As evening settled over London, William stood by his study window, watching the skyline fade. Questions outside grew louder by the hour, but inside he'd already made peace with one certainty. The truth, whatever its cost, would have to come to light. Days following his return unfolded slowly, marked by silence and quiet strength that seemed to grow with each sunrise. Prince William carried himself with renewed purpose. He'd confronted truth in Scotland. Now he bore its weight with calm endurance. Behind palace walls, discussions continued. Advisors debated statements, strategies, the balance between transparency and protection. William listened, but the decision was already forming inside him. He knew the monarchy's survival didn't depend on silence. It depended on trust, and trust, once broken, could only rebuild through honesty. Lessons from his mother's life and echoes of Balmoral had guided him toward one conviction. Truth must never hide for convenience. He thought about generations who'd carried the crown before him. He realized his path would be different. The world was changing. The monarchy's future would demand transparency rather than tradition alone. The monarchy, ideally sooner than later, following his recent less than stellar royal visit overseas. The discovery that once shattered him now gave him clarity. It was no longer just a wound. It had become a turning point. One morning he met his father again. The conversation was quiet but profound. Respect filled the room. In the end, both men understood that change, however painful, was inevitable. William's resolve was clear. His father, recognizing that same strength in him, didn't stand in his way. When he finally stepped before the public again, the air carried different energy. Cameras captured not a prince burdened by secrets, but a man prepared to lead with integrity. In monarchy's quiet corridors, truth rarely comes without cost. Prince William's secret journey to Scotland was more than escape. It was a reckoning. The heir, who once stood in tradition's shadow, returned with clarity of a man who'd faced his own breaking point. The discovery that shook him also shaped him, forging deeper understanding of duty, integrity, and legacy. Scotland became his mirror, reflecting both burden and beauty of truth. The future king has been changed by what he faced in silence. Prince William is second in the line of succession to the British throne. But according to one expert, this future King of England behind polished smiles lies a story of courage. A man learning that real power isn't in the crown, but in the strength to face truth alone and still stand ready to lead. So, what do you think happened during those silent days in Scotland? Drop your thoughts below. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe because there's always more to uncover. Thanks for being here. And so, the story comes full circle. But the truth is still unfolding behind those palace walls. We may never know exactly what was in those documents that sent Prince William fleeing into the Scottish mist. But here's what we do know. Something changed in him. Something broke and then reformed stronger than before. In a world where royalty is supposed to be perfect and untouchable, here was a future king who chose truth over tradition. He could have buried whatever he discovered and carried on like nothing happened. That's what's been done for centuries. But William didn't do that because somewhere between London and those Highland hills, he realized that silence has a price too high to pay. Behind that calm exterior is a man who looked truth in the eye when it would have destroyed a weaker person. A man who chose his mother's path of honesty over the palace's tradition of secrecy.